The topic for debate this evening is one which has risen in prominence within public discourse over the past few years, both here and in Europe. It is a subject characterised by conflicting narratives and one which is having a polarising effect. We're going to cover a number of themes related to the broader topic of Islam within Western society. The speakers will touch on issues such as Islamophobia, reform within Islam, the compatibility of Islam with democracy, radicalisation, the integration of Muslim communities in Western societies, and also the issue of interfaith dialogue. Just in terms of an important caveat about who CSI are, I mean, our role at CSI is not to take sides. Our position on any issue, regardless of how controversial it is one of neutrality. The aim is basically to bridge divides by using dialogue and allow all voices to be heard.
Thanks to CSI for sponsoring this, and the reason that I was interested in hosting this is that I do see the reactions going on against the Islamic community in the United States to be horrific and to be consistent with a pattern of behavior in this nation's history that has always been there, and we have always fought it back, in contrast to some other countries. The notion of hating or fearing a group of people that we don't understand is something that this country has done for a long time. It was interesting, I was at a meeting with, it was an interfaith group, and we were talking about, this was before Representative King had his hearings on Capitol Hill, and we were talking about our feelings about this, and there was a bishop there from the Roman Catholic Church, and he said to all of us, he said, I'm going to talk to Representative King's bishop, because Representative King is a Roman Catholic, and ask him to call Representative King and remind him that this is exactly the way the Irish and the Italians were treated when they came to this country. We were told, the United States citizenry was told that the Irish and the Italians were a threat. They were foreigners, they didn't understand our culture, they weren't willing to assimilate with our culture, they had different values, and most importantly, they had loyalty to a foreign power, the Pope. When I was growing up in Wisconsin, there was a brutal primary, the Wisconsin primary in 1960, in which John Kennedy was running for president. And my father, who was a Protestant pastor there, received just unbelievable amounts of hate literature about John Kennedy, saying that John Kennedy was surely going to turn the country over to the Pope as soon as he was elected. And my dad, who was no fan of the Catholic Church, I must say, ended up preaching a sermon denouncing what was going on. And he said, you know, you folks know that I'm not big on Democrats. You know that I'm not big on Roman Catholics. But what's going on right now is absolutely anti-American and, more importantly, anti-Christian. And we cannot allow people to tell us that we should vote against somebody because they're Roman Catholic and because we fear that they will turn over the United States to the Pope in Rome. When socialist Jews were driven out of Europe, they arrived in the United States and they were uniformly treated as a threat, as subversives to this nation. Been some good books, good movies written about that. My wife, who's Jewish, as she watches the various statements being made on TV about Muslims, her response is always the same. She goes, this is just what they did to us. And indeed, it is. We put the Japanese Americans in concentration camps prior to, we perceived them to be this great internal threat, this subversive force in the United States, and we put loyal citizens in concentration camps, one of the worst marks in this nation's history. Joe McCarthy famously labeled just about anyone who was on the left as a traitor, ruined lives, ruined careers, ruined families. The civil rights movement in this country, which we now look back on as one of the shining moments of glory in our history, the civil rights movement was monitored by the FBI and by many groups on the right wing as a subversive organization that was a threat to the values and culture of this great nation. So it seems to me that it is naive to think that what I call fear-mongering regarding the Muslim population, growing Muslim population in this country, that this is something that is isolated. It's not. It's something that happens in this country. It happens in other countries as well. We're seeing it happen in Europe and elsewhere. But we have successfully fought it off in this country, and it's one of the reasons that we are a great nation. The greatness of this nation is that we have always found a way to integrate and bring people into our culture, and it is my belief that rather than preaching a message of fear about Muslims, what we ought to be doing is, first of all, those of us who are not Muslims should be educating ourselves about Islam, and we should be then reaching out to our neighbors in an attempt to understand them and ask them questions. So for the last 3 years, we've had a Muslim preach here at Western. That's a very intentional strategy. I used to have rabbis preach here. Now I have people from the Muslim community, because they are the people that we need to hear from in our churches in this country. I'm going to read a quote that one of our speakers, Ms. Weiss, wrote in one of her articles. And the name of the article is Lying to the Infidels. And it regarded Keith Ellison, who was a member of Congress. And you'll remember that Representative Ellison wanted to, and I think did, take his oath of office using a Quran that he placed his hand on instead of a Bible. And this is the statement from that article. The Quran, by contrast, teaches that it's okay to lie to infidels if it furthers the cause of Islam. That nation states have no legitimacy, that the only legitimate nation is the nation of Islam, which has no territorial boundaries, and those who do not submit to the will of Allah should be condemned in a life of dimitude, second-class citizenry. Now, it is exactly that kind of fear-mongering that is creating huge problems. We can go through the Jewish scriptures, through the Christian scriptures, through the Hindu scriptures, and pull out passages that would reflect in a similar way to what this passage has been pulled out of the Quran and used in the way that it's used. So, for example, in the Hebrew scriptures, it says that a disobedient child should be stoned to death by his parents. Do any of us think the Jews would do that today? Of course not. And to suggest that a member of Congress is lying to the American public as he places his hand on the Quran, that kind of fear-mongering has to be challenged. And it's one of the reasons that I wanted this to be held here today, and it's one of the reasons that I wanted to be on the panel. We simply have to call this for what it is. So people say to me, well, what about the folks who are Muslims who are after the United States? Because clearly there are some. First of all, my response would be, what about everybody else who's not Muslim who's after the United States? There's a lot of folks in a lot of different religions, and they're very organized and they're very powerful. We have ways of defending ourselves, and we always have. The classic example of this is what happens when we go through airport security. Now, the government has figured out a way, the TSA has figured out a way to screen people without doing some outrageous profiling. There's some profiling that goes on, there's no question about that. But it's not kind of egregious profiling and the kind of stuff that we're seeing in terms of these broad statements by people like Representative King. And there are ways to deal with people who are out to harm us without lumping everybody who's like them. So, I'm old enough to remember the Black Panthers. And I can remember when people tried to scare white people into thinking that all African Americans were as antagonistic towards the white population as Black Panthers were, by their own rhetoric and by their own actions. The white population didn't buy it because it was nonsense. So I think I'm going to stop there simply by saying that Operating out of a base of fear warps human behavior. I follow somebody named Jesus who refused to accept the stereotypes of people who were feared in his society, whether those people were lepers, whether those people were poor people, whether they were Samaritans, whether they were Gentiles. He refused to allow his behavior to be dictated by the fears of those who feared the other. The great people in our society, whether they be Rosa Parks, whether it be somebody like Gandhi in India, all of these people refuse to operate out of a base of fear. Dr. King, who was under constant threat of his life, I mean, they were always after him, and he was getting both verbal and written threats on his life, refused to operate out of a base of fear. He operated out of a base of hope and a base of love, and the reason this nation has been successful to this date in bringing all of these wonderful different cultures and different religions together in the same place to work together and live together, the reason we've been able to do that is because we have not operated as a fearful people. Do not let anyone turn us into a fearful people.